He had been quiet for 3 days, too quiet for a ruler whose breath once rattled an empire. In the marble stillness of Capri, servants moved like ghosts, each afraid to be the one who named what everyone already sensed. Far away, on the mainland, rumors rose like a tide. Not celebration, not yet, just the cautious murmur of a people who had learned the cost of speaking too soon. If you're drawn to the hushed corners of the past, stay with me. We'll walk this road carefully, without spectacle, without needless shock, only truth told in a steady voice. To understand how a lauded general became Rome's long knight, we return to a single wound, a marriage ended by command. Tiberius, the soldier who preferred tents to palaces, had once known a gentler life with Vipsania, shared silences, unguarded mornings, a son who made duty feel human. Then Augustus decided that love was a luxury Rome could not afford. The divorce arrived dressed in the language of destiny. One day she was his anchor, the next, a memory behind a door he no longer had the right to open. What followed wasn't a thunderclap, but a slow turning of the weather. The new marriage, politically perfect, personally disastrous, became a field where bitterness took root. Julia's wit cut, his pride hardened, their home turned into a quiet arena of small humiliations and long, echoing nights. He took refuge in work. Reports from the front grew colder. Decisions once measured by fairness bent toward severity. Lists appeared, names of rivals, slights real and imagined, tallied with a clerk's precision. Wine filled the gaps where sleep wouldn't come. Grief changed shape when fate touched his son. The message arrived with the bluntness of Roman courier script. Drusus is gone. No marching orders can be written for that kind of sentence. Something inside Tiberius sealed shut. The man who had organized chaos on distant rivers now organized pain at home, investigations without end, circles of suspicion widening through corridors and courtyards. Law, once a shield, became a net. He came to believe that safety lived not in crowds, but in distance. Capri, steep, sea-bright, unreachable without permission, promised control. Villas rose where gulls once nested, corridors overlapped like labyrinths, doors multiplied, and whispers thinned in the salt air. The court that gathered there felt less like government and more like an experiment in total privacy. Advisors who specialized in closing loopholes, stewards who learned that questions were a form of disloyalty, messengers who walked carefully because words had grown sharp edges. From the island, decrees flowed back to Rome with the rhythm of the tides. Each one tightened a different knot. Speech trimmed to safe phrases, friendships reduced to careful nods, the habit of looking over one's shoulder practiced until it felt natural. And yet, even as fear spread, the man at the center of it all was not invincible. Age pressed in, illness humbled vanity, curtains were drawn, mirrors turned to the wall, and perfume could not quite persuade the air to forget. Outside, the city learned to wait without blinking. Inside, on those quiet halls of stone and water, a final silence gathered itself for the leap no one could stop. The silence on Capri was not only the silence of a dying emperor, but of an entire empire holding its breath. Rumors traveled faster than ships. Whispers reached Rome that the man who had wrapped the city in shadows was faltering, though none dared to speak too loudly. They had learned that hope itself could be a trap. For years, Tiberius had used fear as his most effective weapon, reshaping law and custom until every Roman lived under suspicion. Informers thrived in this world, turning chance remarks into accusations, accusations into trials, and trials into sentences no one could escape. Property shifted hands, friendships dissolved, and families broke apart under the weight of whispered words. The empire had become a stage where loyalty was performed, not lived. Yet beneath the machinery of terror, something more personal lingered. Tiberius never recovered from the loss of his first wife, nor from the early death of his son. Those wounds never healed, they calcified, twisting into a ruler who trusted no one and sought to bend everyone else to the same loneliness. His isolation on Capri wasn't just strategic, it was the logical end of a man who had convinced himself that closeness was weakness. The villas he ordered were less palaces than fortresses of secrecy, each designed to prevent intrusion, each echoing with a silence that seemed to grow heavier with time. Still, governance required an appearance of order. Letters carried his will across the sea, and magistrates in Rome learned to interpret silence as permission to act. Laws grew harsher, punishments swifter. Citizens found themselves condemned not for what they did, but for who they were related to, or for what they failed to say when rumor passed by their ears. Guilt became hereditary, suspicion became contagious. Rome itself had changed. Conversations in the forum were clipped, laughter scarce, even joy treated as dangerous. But time is a patient adversary, one no emperor can outmaneuver. As the years passed, Tiberius's body betrayed him. Illness wore him down. His face, once stern and commanding, became something he sought to hide from those around him. Servants avoided eye contact, not only out of fear, but because the sight unsettled them. He banned mirrors, as if their reflections could reveal the truth he wished to escape. That power cannot stop the slow undoing of flesh. Meanwhile, across the empire, people learned a different kind of endurance. They survived by speaking in riddles, by erasing their own thoughts, by teaching their children silence as the safest language. The shadow of Capri stretched far beyond the cliffs, reshaping Roman life into something brittle, and yet, like all shadows, it depended on the presence of the figure who cast it. By the year 37 AD, that figure was fading. The letters grew fewer. The decrees arrived more erratic. The empire, conditioned to constant vigilance, noticed the gaps. Markets hesitated. Families whispered. Soldiers glanced at one another with unspoken questions. Something had shifted. For the first time in decades, there was the faintest suggestion that Rome might wake from its long night. The first signs of collapse were not shouts, but absences. Ships that once carried precise orders from Capri returned empty, their sails heavy with silence. Couriers who normally hurried across the empire slowed, uncertain whether their messages still carried the emperor's will. For years, Rome had existed in a state of constant surveillance, where each rumor of illness was followed by brutal purges. Now, the silence itself became unsettling. No one dared to interpret it aloud, but all felt the same tremor. Perhaps the man who had ruled through fear was finally gone. Still, restraint lingered. Too many had celebrated too early before, only to find their names on lists of the condemned. Rome's people had learned to bury their emotions, to feign grief when joy threatened to surface. Taverns buzzed with muted speculation, temples filled with offerings, cloaked in other names, and merchants kept their stalls half open, uncertain if prosperity or punishment lay ahead. Even hope had become dangerous. Inside the island villas, the atmosphere had shifted as well. Servants who once moved as though the walls themselves listened, now risked glances at one another, silent exchanges of questions too heavy for words. Guards, who had been instruments of cruelty, set down their spears when news crept through corridors. The emperor was motionless. Days passed. The air grew heavier, with the unmistakable scent of absence, something no incense could disguise. When at last a servant entered the chamber and saw him lying still, eyes open yet unseeing, the truth could no longer be denied. The confirmation spread cautiously, carried by signal fires from Capri's cliffs to the mainland. Rome, always quick to gather voices, responded first with whispers, then with cries. The words repeated themselves like waves. The emperor is dead. It was not a proclamation, but a release. Years of silence cracked open in a single chant that surged through narrow streets, markets, and finally the great forums where power had once paraded. Celebration erupted, but it was tinged with unease. After decades of conditioning, Laughter felt foreign, music reckless, and even joy seemed to carry the risk of betrayal. Some wept openly, not from grief, but from disbelief that survival was possible. Others embraced strangers in crowded squares, bound together not by affection, but by relief that they had endured the same shadow. Yet beneath the cheers, scars remained. Children who had grown up under terror clung to parents with blank eyes, unable to understand the sudden reversal. Adults flinched at every burst of song, waiting for punishment that never came. Back on Capri, darker discoveries emerged as villas were opened. Rooms once hidden revealed their secrets, corridors lined with records that listed names crossed out with careful precision. The architecture itself told stories of a ruler who sought control over every breath that reached his island. Survivors began to step forward, figures who had lived half-lives in silence, now blinking at the sunlight, as if seeing it for the first time. Their presence was both proof of survival and a reminder of what had been endured. Rome celebrated, yes, but celebration could not erase memory. The empire had gained freedom, but freedom laced with the knowledge of how fragile it truly was. The Senate convened in hurried sessions, torn between tradition and outrage. By custom, emperors were honored with state funerals, their remains treated as divine. But how could Rome drape purple cloth over the memory of a ruler who had made terror a daily ritual? Voices clashed across marble chambers. Some argued for forgetting, for burying him quietly to end the chapter without spectacle. Others demanded his body be thrown into the river, as enemies of Rome once were, a gesture to show the people that even emperors could be judged. While senators debated, the body decayed, a symbol of the paralysis he had left behind. Outside those halls, the people had already made their decision. Crowds surged into the streets, chanting words no censor could silence. To the Tiber with Tiberius. It was not just a demand for disposal, but for purification. Water had always symbolized renewal in Roman life, and after decades of fear, citizens longed for cleansing. Taverns opened their cellars freely, music rang from doorways, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed without disguise. But beneath the celebrations, wounds showed plainly. Families reunited with survivors, yet found them changed. Children who had grown in the shadow of Capri did not know how to smile. Parents held them as though afraid they might vanish again, whispering promises the empire could not guarantee. The institutions of Rome, too, bore scars. Law itself had been twisted into an instrument of cruelty. Decrees remained in archives, precedents written in official hands, reminders that the empire had once codified suspicion and betrayal. Some officials argued these records should be destroyed, erasing the stain. Others insisted they must remain as evidence, so that no one could later claim ignorance. Rome stood at a crossroads, to forget or to remember. Forgetting risked repetition. Remembering meant living with the knowledge of how quickly society could bend to fear. Capri was abandoned soon after. Its villas, once built for secrecy, became ruins overtaken by wind and gulls. Fishermen whispered that the island was cursed, that cries could still be heard on stormy nights. Whether true or not, few were willing to test the rumor. Stones cracked, gardens withered, and the sea carried away traces of the empire's darkest retreat. Yet history does not remain silent. Stories traveled, carried by survivors, by servants who had once walked those halls, and by citizens who had seen too much to ever forget. They spoke of an emperor who began as a soldier, hardened by loss, and ended as a shadow who could not even face his own reflection. And they spoke of a city that had learned to endure silence, suspicion, and cruelty until freedom arrived too suddenly to feel real. Rome celebrated its liberation, but celebrations fade. What lingered was unease, the quiet recognition that the capacity for such darkness had not died with one man. The empire itself had absorbed his methods, and future rulers would find those precedents waiting. In the bright aftermath of Tiberius's death, Rome discovered that survival was not the same as healing. The question remained, had the nightmare truly ended, or had it simply changed shape? The morning after celebration, Rome awoke uneasy. The wine had been poured, the chants had filled the air, and yet the city felt hollow, as though centuries of fear could not be washed away overnight. Markets reopened, but vendors spoke in half-whispers, their voices still trained by caution. Children played in alleys, but their games mimicked interrogations and accusations, echoes of the world they had inherited. Freedom had arrived, but it did not feel light. It felt heavy, burdened with memory. In Capri's abandoned halls, investigators found remnants of a system built to turn suspicion into routine. Scrolls marked with names, columns of accusations, records of property seized from the condemned. The bureaucracy of fear was as detailed as any tax ledger. Every confiscated farm, every seized villa, every life ended had been written down with the precision of a bookkeeper. These papers revealed the deepest truth. Cruelty had not been chaos, but administration. It had been organized, methodical, and disturbingly rational. Rome realized with a shudder that what had been done once could be done again. Some senators wanted to erase it all, to burn the documents and pretend the nightmare had never existed. Others argued that to forget was to invite its return. In heated debates, voices cracked with the weight of history. How could a society return to trust when betrayal had been rewarded for decades? How could neighbors look each other in the eyes, knowing some had informed to save themselves, while others had died because of a careless word? The empire was free, yes, but freedom demanded answers Rome was not ready to give. Meanwhile, the people found their own rituals of release. Taverns filled with songs that had once been forbidden, crude verses mocking a ruler who had claimed divinity. Street performers acted out parodies of imperial decrees, laughter spilling where silence had once reigned. For the first time in years, the air in Rome felt unshackled. But when the music quieted, silence returned heavier than before. Trauma lingered in the corners. Parents who had lost children carried their grief like invisible armor. Survivors who returned from Capri walked streets that felt foreign, their eyes older than their years. Some could not bear to stay and fled to distant provinces, hoping anonymity could provide peace. Yet history has a cruel rhythm. Even as Rome breathed relief, eyes turned toward a young man who had been watching, learning. Caligula, heir to power, had studied both the fear his predecessor inspired and the celebrations that followed his death. He understood that terror and devotion were not opposites, but two sides of the same coin. In him, the lessons of Tiberius would not be buried, but transformed. The empire had rid itself of one shadow only to invite another, and so the story closes, not with triumph, but with warning. Tiberius's death did not end Rome's struggle with power. It revealed it. The empire had survived, but survival alone was not victory. What had been shown once could be repeated, reshaped, perfected by the rulers who followed. His villas crumbled, his ashes were quietly interred, but the memory of what Rome endured remained carved into its foundations. Power, once corrupted, leaves stains that no river can cleanse. If stories like this one draw you in, if you seek the darker lessons history whispers when the world is quiet, make sure you stay with us. There are more shadows to explore, more truths that refuse to stay buried. Subscribe and walk with me into the next chapter of the past.